Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Crime Fiction panel. My name is Ashley Rayner. I'm a librarian at NORC at the University of Chicago, and I'll be your moderator. All of these books stressed me out and kept me up way past my bedtime, but I mean like stressed in a good way, if that makes sense. And I'm sure they'll enthrall you too. I have four authors with me today that I'm so excited to talk to. The first is William Boyle, author of Saint of the Narrow Street, published by Soho Crime, about a new mom who kills her out of control husband. I swear it's like really early in the book, it's not a spoiler, and keeps the secret with her sister and neighborhood friend. Ron Currie, the savage author of The Savage Noble Death of Babs Dionne, published by Putnam, about a French neighborhood mob that starts getting too much attention from outsiders. Laurie L. Dove, author of Mask of the Dear Woman, published by Berkley, about a disgraced ex-cop who returns to her father's reservation to be a marshal and encounters a series of disappearances. And last but not least, Brendan Slocumb, author of The Dark Maestro, published by Doubleday, about a cello prodigy forced to go undercover and how he and his family fight back against those who wronged them. Hello, everyone.
Hi.
Okay, let's get started because I have a lot of questions and we want to make sure we get to all of them. Audience, please ask questions and we will get to them if we get a chance, but I'm sure we will do our best. My first question is for Brendan, author of The Dark Maestro. When The Dark Maestro starts, Curtis, the protagonist, is surprised by the revelation that he will have to go immediately into the witness protection program. Do not pass go, do not collect $200. Why did you decide to throw readers into your story in media res rather than at the beginning?
Well, first, thank you so much for having me here. It's a pleasure to be here today. Happy to be here with all these amazing authors on this panel. Um, I started right in the middle because it, lately, the things that I've been reading and writing, I just find them much more interesting if you think you know what's going to happen. You think you can figure it out from the very, oh, I totally got the story. I know exactly what's going on. I know who's going to do this and do this and do this. And I like to throw people for a loop. I like to be entertained when I'm reading, and I want to make sure that the audience is entertained and always keep them on their toes. And half the people that have read Dark Maestro swear they know exactly what's going on from the very beginning, and then no, not even close. So I just think it's an interesting tool, and I had a lot of fun writing stories that way.
I'm trying to remember if I thought I knew. I do think I know what's going on at all times, so I probably was surprised. But like, yeah, it really there were quite a few loops thrown for me, so it definitely worked. It was definitely kept me on my toes.
Yes.
Thank you so much. Yeah, success. My next question is for William, author of Saint of the Narrow Street. I realize that Fab is there's a couple of protagonists in this book, but he starts out as a baby in the book. Uh, we're the same age. We're close to the same age. I think he's a couple years younger than me. So reading this novel took me back through time. Why did you decide to have the novel progress in jumps rather than like a straight chronology?
Thank you. Great to be here. Thanks for having me. Yeah. So I mean, I think I've always kind of thought of myself as a coward when it comes to time in a novel. I like to read novels that are set over long periods of time, but I've always found it challenging to write that way. Most of my books are set over a few days. So I kind of found a way to cheat with this book, I think. It's set across 18 years and there's four different parts. And so there's kind of jumps of 8 years, 9 years throughout the book. But you're dropped down in moments that are set over a day or a day and a half. So I'm still kind of keeping it tight and compressed, but spreading it out across these four different moments that we drop into. I don't know. I mean, I was thinking of the film, the Richard Linklater film Boyhood a lot, I guess. I was thinking about how that movie just kind of drops into moments through time. And I thought, if I could do that with a crime novel, that would be interesting and just kind of drop into these moments. Fab is as you said, he's a baby when the novel starts and he's 18 at the end of the novel. So it kind of traces that same trajectory, even though he's not really the main character. His mother, Rissa, and her sister Julia are kind of the main characters. But so I kind of used that as a model, I think, and had fun kind of dropping into these moments of crisis across 18 years.
You got right to the good stuff. It's all killer, no filler. I love it. My next question is for Ron, author of The Savage Noble Death of Babs Dionne. I don't speak French. Is that Dionne. Okay. I love mob stories, and this might be one of the most interesting ones I've ever experienced because they're so rarely matrilineal. You know, I used to get like Goodfellas or Godfather, where it's always the father. Why did you make Babs, who's kind of like this I would say badass. It's kind of early for badass, but badass mom. Why did you make her the leader of the outfit rather than her husband?
Um, as with everybody else, I'm really glad to be here, and I find myself wanting to start moderating instead of answering the questions that are for me and ask questions and nerd out. But I know. The short answer is that is the kind of environment I grew up in. Um, there are people who would disagree with me on this point, as I'm sure there are people who will disagree with me on every way that I portray the Franco-American experience in New England in this book. But my experience of it was that it was very much not just matrilineal, but also matriarchal, right? Like women ran the neighborhood I grew up in. And it was very closed off. It was very insular. Everybody spoke French. Um, and the men were either, in my experience, the men were either at work, at the bar, or dead. And in some instances, they were in prison, but the men just weren't present for the most part. And I was fascinated by my grandmother and her friends because I was straddling two worlds in a way. I obviously I write in English. I don't speak a lick of French. My father didn't speak English until he went to school. So in one generation, that entire language disappeared and the culture along with it. And so I was fascinated by my grandmother and her friends from the neighborhood because they would sit around her kitchen table and rip cigarettes and chatter in Quebecois. And I could sort of, kind of get the gist of what they were saying, but I think ultimately what it instilled in me is a deep interest both in preserving that world, which no longer exists, right? It's gone now, almost entirely, but also in examining um, women's relationships with one another, whether friendships, mothers and daughters, which also occurs in the book with Babs and Laurie, obviously. And I was really interested in what would happen when I took these characters and made them adjacent to real power, particularly in America, right? So that's the longer version of the answer, but really it boils down to the fact that my grandmother was a hard and loving woman who I loved the shit out of, and uh, she inspired this more than anything else.
Yeah, I could see it. My grandmother is still alive and she's terrifying, but also very loving. So I completely get the vibe. My next question is for Laurie Eldov, author of Mask of the Deer Woman. And like I told Laurie before we started, I'm from Chicago and I'm annoying about being from Chicago, like all good Chicagoans are. Why did your protagonist come from Chicago, of all places, to a reservation in Kansas? What is it about the contrast of those places that you found compelling to write about?
Well, I'm delighted to be here. I've had the most pleasurable last week, 10 days, reading everyone else's novels. And so this has absolutely been the most fun. I like to think of setting as character, as that informative to the book. And like the characters themselves, I feel like these places have their distinct personalities. So when Star, the main character, goes from where she has been raised in Chicago, she moves onto the border of Kansas, Oklahoma. She lives in Kansas, drives over the border to this reservation in Oklahoma. And I find that this contrast in place, it really mirrors all of the contrasts that these characters have, particularly Star, of living in the spaces in between, of navigating these identities that are really steeped in contrast that I think we probably all experience in some way.
I thought it was Kansas. I'm so sorry. I get to the Great Plains and it all kinds of runs together. I'm a Midwesterner. I'm so sorry.
You're not wrong. She does live in Kansas and then
Okay.
drives right over that border to the
Oh
reservation.
my God. I'm so embarrassed. Okay.
Oh, you're good.
Thank you so much for understanding. My next question is for Brendan. I've never written a novel, so I can't imagine writing one with three points of view. We have Curtis, who's kind of the protagonist. He's this wonderful cellist who gets caught up in his parents' kind of situation. Larissa, his stepmother, and Zachariah, better known as Zippy. So those are the three, and that's his father. Which point of view was your favorite to write, and why? Brendan, you're on mute. I know
Rookie mistake. I'm sorry.
it's okay.
I enjoyed writing all three points of view, to be honest. But I think it was the most fun to write Curtis, obviously, and probably Larissa was a close second, but I think Zippy, just because they are such different people. I think Larissa and Zippy kind of go together a bit more than Curtis, his natural father. So that was a lot of fun to do, writing those contrasts between the two. It was especially, because Curtis starts off as a little boy, and your personalities change and develop according to who you're around. And maybe he picks up on some of Zippy's traits, maybe he picks up on some of Larissa's traits. You never really know what's going to happen. But Zippy was a lot of fun to write too, because I'm telling you, all of these people, we all can relate to these people in some way, shape, or form. We all know a Zippy and a Curtis, and we all know them. So it was kind of fun to write. I was pulling aspects of people I know, people from my life, to form these characters. So I really enjoyed writing Curtis, from the standpoint of being a musician, because I could relate to everything that he was experiencing and everything that he was going to experience. And that was a lot of fun. And Zippy reminded me of all of my father's friends, every single one of them. I'm just kind of like, yeah, any one of them could have been Zippy. So, just pulling from experiences and people that I knew, or, knew of, it was a lot of fun to do, but definitely fun writing Curtis from the standpoint of a musician.
I always find it so confusing when people say I can't relate with this character because they're this way or they don't look like me, or I, if you can't find something to relate about almost any person, I'm like I don't know how you exist, because I feel like there's always something that you can connect to somebody with. And so
I
even though
agree.
I have never, I did play violin for a short amount of time, not very well. So, but I still understood the idea of like doing this for love of the game, and I really liked Curtis's. And you played for a long time, or do you still play? You still play, right?
I still play. My fiddle is right there on the on my desk, and I got to play at a Christmas party on Thursday. So yeah, I'm practicing after this.
Amazing. It was so much fun to read. My next question is for William. You've got three, similarly, you've got three co-conspirators in this book trying to keep this terrible secret. Rissa, Chooch, and Julia. Which one is best at keeping the secret, and which one is the worst at it, in your opinion?
It's a good question. I mean, I think Rissa is probably the best, and both she and Chooch have in common the fact that their worlds are pretty small, and so they don't really have the opportunity as much to, to spill. They keep their their world's very tight, very insular. So I think probably be between the two of them. They'll probably Rissa, because she's got more on the line, and Chooch is kind of more conflicted about things. But Julia is probably would be the worst, because I don't know. There's definitely parts of the book where it's kind of, well, it's clear, and then it's clear that she's got this whole other life where she's hanging out at the bar all the time. And it's maybe implied several times throughout the book that there are scenes that happen kind of off the page where people are gossiping at the bar and things are kind of happening at the bar. So I think for her, as sort of an alcoholic, I guess, who's hanging out at this neighborhood dive bar, probably harder for her to keep things under wraps, and not in the way that she's anxious to let the secret out, more in the way that she is kind of hopping to the defense of her sister, and the whole kind of situation, and might just kind of let things slip.
Okay, I'm going off script for a second. Do you think they keep their lives insular because of the secret, or would they have done that anyway?
I think I think both of them would have done it anyway. Chooch and
Interesting.
Ruther are just kind of that's their whole life is the neighborhood, and
Mhm.
they're not people who are kind of itching to break away from the neighborhood. Whereas Julia, I think so much of what goes on with her in the book stems from the fact that she probably should have left the neighborhood and had opportunities to leave and didn't, and it's kind of feels trapped now. But for them, they it's their whole world.
I just made that whole speech about relating to people. I can't relate to that, but I guess I did move back to my neighborhood, so who am I to judge? My next question is from Ron. The characters in your book are haunted by ghosts, literally and figuratively. How does the past affect Babs, who's the main, I guess, mob leader, and her daughter Laurie, who's a veteran who's come back from, I can't remember which war it is, and she comes back and kind of works with her mom to keep the peace in the neighborhood as it is.
Yeah, Laurie, she's an Afghanistan vet. She did 3 tours in Afghanistan. And she's the one who sees and interacts with really kind of socializes with ghosts in this book. But we're going to find out in the next book when we go back to 1984 that Babs has this ability as well, right? So here, honestly, I just wanted a shortcut that allowed me to dramatize grief. Grief is really hard to write because it's internal, right? I mean, and I could give you 5 pages of somebody's interior landscape as it's laid waste to and burned to a crisp by grief. But what's more interesting to me is to dramatize it, put it in scene. And so, how do we do that? Well, we bring back the dead, right? And we let them talk to the living. And so, um, they're just technicolor grief ultimately. So Laurie sees. For example, her father, Rial, who died recently, and that's part of the reason Laurie has come back because her father's gone, her mother's losing her grip a little bit, Babs is slipping a little bit, and she needs help. But Laurie doesn't really want to be there. And another thing that I think is really interesting about the ghost, and that I hope I've accomplished, is to demonstrate that grief in all of its registers, right? Like sometimes grief can be funny in its way, right? When we recall things about somebody that made us laugh, or when we realize we're being maudlin, right? Like it can be funny. And so, for example, with Sammy, Laurie's war buddy, who we see killed in a sort of flashback, um, but he's a giant pain in the ass. He was a giant pain in the ass in life, and he's a giant pain in the ass in death. And he drives Laurie crazy. He never shuts up. He's constantly complaining. And so he's not Marley, rattling his chains. He's what he was in life to Laurie, which is somebody who she loved deeply, who also irritated the living shit out of her. And so, you know, in that regard, I think it shows different facets of grief. It's not just a funeral dirge in that way, right?
I was making the shocked Pikachu face because I didn't know there's going to be a sequel, and I'm delighted about that. That's
Yeah,
going to
yeah.
be
We've got 2 more
or
coming,
prequel, I guess it is.
assuming we're all here.
I'm going to be here so I can read the book. I don't know about you. I'm too stubborn to miss out. Um, oh wait, and then I hope everybody takes a look at the chat because there's a couple of comments that are pretty funny. But anyway, my next question is for Laurie. The protagonist of The Mask of the Deer Woman, we already mentioned her. Her name is Carrie Starr. We're talking about grief, right? She's dealing with the loss of her daughter and the loss of her life in Chicago, two separate but connected losses. How did you decide to use grief as a driving force in your novel?
That part of it just happened. When I started writing this, I wasn't even sure what kind of book it was going to be, but I knew I had this character and I wanted to see what happened. And she often surprised me. But what I liked especially about her was that she was someone who, as happens in real life sometimes, pulled herself out of the abyss every morning and kept going. And that felt like an important and maybe cathartic character to write at that time. And in the end, what I discovered is that like Ron said, all of this grief is really balanced by a hopefulness in the end. And then this maybe not discovery, but reminder that people are so incredibly resilient. We have the ability to persevere. And even when we don't think we're going to survive something, we can.
It reminds me of all the like there's inspirational stuff on Instagram, right? Where it's like you've survived all your hardest days, right?
Mhm.
You've lived through these hard times. And so I think as as life goes on and you get some of those hard times, it's a nice reminder that like you can survive. You can, and hopefully you will. My next question is for Brendan. I personally love when authors talk about music in their books. So, and like Brendan mentioned, he's a amazing musician. And so classical music is not normally what I listen to, but I listen to a lot of it because throughout the book, it's like different composers, some I heard of, some I had not. And so I wanted to hear what Curtis, your protagonist, was playing. I wanted to get the vibe and be in the room. What is your favorite piece that you mentioned in the novel, and why did you include it?
I dread this question, especially as a musician, because I don't think I've given the same answer twice to this ever. Um, I reference the piece, it's a French piece by Gabriel Fauré called the Elegy. It's one of the most beautiful pieces I've ever heard. And I've always loved it. And that's the piece that I wish I played cello. I wish I was a cellist just so I could play that piece. Not only is it beautiful, it's very solemn, very sad, and I think it's the perfect expression of what Curtis is going through after he realizes that everything gets ripped away from him, everything. So I think that's a very, very appropriate piece, and it's fun to play and it's fun to listen to, and it is just an incredible piece of music. I mean, don't get me wrong, there are several pieces in the story that I reference, and I'm going to do a playlist of those pieces as well. And it's just all of it, all that music is just phenomenal, and I wish I had more time, more pages to write so I could include more music, but I think 400 pages is enough. But yeah.
And a couple of people are saying, oh, will music be incorporated into the audio again, into the audiobook? Do you know?
We are in discussions right now. I am hoping so. I think that worked really well with Violent Conspiracy, and we're going to try to do the same thing with Dark Maestro, and hopefully it will work. And I hope. See, last time for Violent Conspiracy, they gave me 2 days to play all of that music, and I was like, there's no way, it's not going to happen. So, whatever they have available, we'll try to fit it in.
Wait, I'm sorry, you played the music for it?
No, they asked me to, but
Okay.
I mean, every piece of music that you heard, they gave me. I had 2 days to do it, and I was like, I can't do this in 2 days.
Oh my God, that's amazing.
Yeah, it was a
So
lot.
much talent. Yeah. If we're talking about music, my next question is for Ron. I got really excited. So at the very beginning of the book, I forget what you call it, like not the acknowledgement, the very beginning, there's an Idols quote, and Idols is a punk band from England that I really like. And the quote is, I am the prophecy. I did not come from nothing, and nothing came from me. I took your name in vain, and I burnt your effigy. That's from Car Crash by the Idols. How does that particular song connect to the story that you wanted to tell, Ron?
It's a couple of ways. I'm unmuted, right? A couple of ways. Obviously that quote, at least to my interpretation, is engaged with he's talking in my mind, he's speaking to God, right? Um, I took your name in vain, I burned your effigy. And the prophecy line at the beginning also, obviously references the divine. And this book, in part, is a long overdue conversation between me and the Catholic Church, which I was raised in as a good French Canadian, or I'm not French Canadian, Franco American. And even though I'm as lapsed as a Catholic could be, um, it's still as much a cultural identity as it is a religious one, and you don't jettison that, right? And so um, I had things with regard to my relationship to the church, my relationship to scripture, that I wanted again to dramatize through the book, and through Babs in particular. Um, as she has one of her closest relationships is with Father Clement, obviously. who himself is not exactly the sort of person you would expect to be a priest. He's got a pretty shady background before he came to the priesthood, and so in any event, I think that quote for me encapsulates the sort of push-pull, love-hate feeling that I have whenever I set foot in a Catholic church. And certainly that's the case for Babs. I mean, the church saves her, right? At the beginning of the book, the church saves her. But it also harbors secrets and keeps, her contention is the church keeps people poor. She makes a comment about Mother Teresa that's not very flattering at some point during the book. So it's the ambiguity of her relationship with the church and with God is really encapsulated in that quote, I would say.
Yeah,
Or
so,
ambivalence, rather.
no, I feel like I know more lapsed Catholics than current Catholics at this point. Like it's so, but
There's a
it
reason
is
for that.
yeah, it's a very it's very interesting to see how even if you're not still part of the church, how much it like affects you and how much you still that vibe that still is part of you. My
Sure.
next question is for William. Who are so and please forgive me because the thing that I thought of when I was thinking about all the different characters in your book, all the little side characters, the song Piano Man um by Billy Joel. And by that I mean there's just like a bunch of like auxiliary characters and they've got like a little bit of personality and they're kind of funny and um there's a lot of neighborhood characters in this book. And my favorite was Jane the Stain. Are they based off of anyone? Do you have like any favorites? Is there one that you were like, oh, I gotta make sure they pop up like multiple times? Tell me about the side characters that I thought were so interesting.
Thanks. Yeah, also I call myself Catholic haunted, so I think this is a really Catholic haunted novel. Um, and you know, writing the neighborhood, writing these kind of side characters is always a lot of fun for me. I think I grew up kind of with a love of naming from my grandfather, who had a nickname for everybody. I mean, he never called anybody by their name. He had names for everybody, and they were always kind of like his best friend was Harry the horse, like names like that. So I always had a fascination with that, and also with, kind of talking about the mob earlier, mob names, and so I love naming characters. I love, one of the great joys I think of writing for me is kind of having people wander in somewhere and kind of discovering characters I hadn't anticipated writing. Very often, it's in bars. There's a bar called the Crisscross Cocktail Lounge in this book, which is where a lot of these characters kind of congregate, including Jane the Stain. So yeah, I mean the short answer is there's no one specific. They're very rarely modeled on anybody specific. Sometimes they're kind of a mix of people I've known, but mostly it's just imagination, invention. I love Jane the Stain too. She's probably my favorite character, to the point where I kind of, several times I kind of wished I was writing a book about her where she was kind of the main character instead of a side character. Maybe someday that'll happen. I mean, sometimes, I definitely see, I mean, I love books and I love reading, but I also grew up an avid movie lover, and so it's hard for me not to imagine like actors I like in certain roles. And I think for Jane the Stain, like I was particularly thinking about like Faye Dunaway and Barfly, like this kind of dignified alcoholic. And yeah, and there's I mean somewhere when my style sheet came back from my publisher, they made a list of all of the character names in my book, and oh, there's an awful lot. I mean, there's 5 or 6 main characters, but then it's got to be somewhere in the low hundreds of, just kind of other names that get mentioned. People we meet and people that are in kind of backstories. So yeah, that's one of the great joys for me.
Is giving NPC like I don't know if you play video games, but like a lot of times there's like non-playable characters walking around and they may not, like, you don't play that, like you don't play as them, but like they give the game character, right? So
Yeah,
like in
yeah.
some places, you know, it just they help the vibe. And so I think that's what the side characters really give a lot of color to the novel. They give a lot of like, okay, this is what this neighborhood is like. You got these kind of people hanging around. So you know the vibe immediately. So I think it works really well. I just want to point out there are a lot of, I've seen the term lapsed Catholic, recovering Catholic, Catholic haunted. Oh, that, I think that's what you said. Yeah, so like there's lots of lapsed Catholics in solidarity. If you guys need a support group, it is in the chat right now. Also, a lot of people want to be terrifying but loving grandmothers. Laurie, no relation to the Laurie. Oh no, that's you. Wait, which Laurie is that? No, a different Laurie. A different Laurie says, I aspire to be a terrifying and loving grandmother, but upon the both births of my grandchildren, immediately became to utter the word no. Became unable to utter the word no, which is very relatable. All right. Next question is for Laurie, our Laurie on the panel, not the Laurie in the chat. Mask of the Dear Woman has a heavy pinch of magical realism, to the point where a lot of times it's like, wait, what is this real? Is this fantasy? What's going on here? How do you think adding a bit of uncertainty enhances your plot?
I love this question. And I will say that is also me in the chat. I have these 4 grandchildren now, and I have no boundaries whatsoever. Like my children are like, what has happened to you? But what I love about magical realism is, um, you know, life is ambiguous. And I've had years, as I'm sure we all have, that have had more questions than answers. And I like magical realism in books because I feel like as a reader, it encourages me to step out of the ordinary, to not just filter and understand things automatically, but to consider in a new way the miraculous world that we live in and all of the things about it we may not understand. And that's really what I wanted to infuse into the novel.
I there yeah, I remember like reading about like deep sea stuff and like the creepy creatures down there, and I'm like, you know, maybe there's some things that we're not meant to understand, and like that's okay. Like I'm not going down there. So I love the idea of like the curiosity and the questioning, and the fact that not everything is like so black and white, so written out, so simple, because rarely is it that way in this world, for better or worse. I have to,
Yes.
yeah, I have to apologize because now someone's like, they're also practicing Catholics here, so I'm, you know, I don't mean to offend the Catholic community. I'm so sorry, guys. I think it's really fascinating to hear people talk about religion and how it affected their life, even if they're not currently practicing. So I'm sorry, I didn't mean to offend any practicing Catholics. And now I'm gonna be banned from Library Journal. It's fine. Brendan, my next question is for you. You're a talented musician. We've said that many times, and it's so accurate. I didn't expect to see rap lyrics in the novel. There's to make a very long story short, the Dark Maestro is a superhero that Curtis and his family make, and Curtis plays music, and his father raps over it, and it works in a way. It's like, wait, what? But it's so it makes sense. Are you branching out to new genres, or have you been rapping for a while? Is this like a hidden talent that we're learning about?
No, I wrote one rap in this book. I only wrote one. I happen to think it's the best, but only because I wrote it. And no, I have loved hip hop music, rap music, classical music, country music, hard rock music, grunge music. I'm a musician. I love it all. And just being able to incorporate, you know, classical music and hip hop has been, it was a lot of fun. I actually called a friend of mine who is a rapper. He's really good. He's out of New York, and you're gonna see him somewhere. He's gonna be big. He's really gonna be big. I called him up and I was like, dude, um, so I'm writing this book. Can you write some lyrics for me? He's like, what's it called? Dark Maestro. Got it. I said, okay, great. And every rap lyric in the book, he wrote them all for me, and it's just, I mean, it worked. Like you mentioned, I think it really worked well. And it's fun to incorporate something that I'm terrible at. You know, I can repeat a song all day long, but you ask me to make up a rap, that's going to be a hard no. But yeah, it's definitely a lot of fun to incorporate different aspects of music. You know, I'm a huge fan of Black violin, and I actually asked them to read this book. You know, they read Violent Conspiracy and was just like, oh my gosh, this is like the story of my life. All right, this is great, awesome. So they could definitely relate to Dark Maestro as well. And it's just like I mentioned, it's so much fun including something that I'm not good at doing to be able to include it in the story with something that I am pretty good at doing with the classical aspect.
Yeah, as a former gifted child, it's really hard sometimes to be like, oh, I'm not good at this, so I don't want to do it, right? And so I'm trying to push forward and do some things that I'm not good at, so that it's okay to fail. It's okay to not get it right immediately. I'm not saying you failed. I'm talking about myself, but I think, and also I love the mashup of genres. I remember, I feel like in the early 2000s there was like a ton of like classical, like that. Her name was like Miri Ben Ami, and she was like a violinist, and she was in a lot of hip hop songs. I'm thinking specifically of Twista's Overnight Celebrity. So there was this violin in the
Right.
background over this like super fast rapping, and it worked. So like,
Yep.
there's precedent for sure. I
Yeah,
love
yeah.
mashing up genres like that. So see, now I get to recommend music to you. That's great. My next question is for Ron. There is a character in your book called the Man, which, of course, that immediately made my hackles rise, but he's like a different man from the Man. He's his own man. And he's kind of like he's unfortunately my favorite character in the book. I'm like, why do I love a psycho so much? But he's like a more charming Anton Sugar from No Country for Old Men, if you remember that kind of like killing machine, but at least he like will talk to you first. How do you humanize such an inhuman character?
Well, it's probably worth noting that, and this is not really giving something away, I don't think. It's worth noting that if you think about it, he doesn't actually commit any acts of violence in the entire book. He talks about it a lot. But basically, the juice for him in the job that he does, and he's certainly capable of tremendous violence. He's not making idle threats, but the juice for him is in manipulating people emotionally and cognitively, right? So that's where I think the charm comes in, and his charm is like a very upright, waspy kind of charm, but it's real and it's effective. Um, but to me, both as a human being and particularly as a writer, I think there are very, very few monsters in the world. I think there's sort of like you were saying earlier about there's almost always something that you can glom onto and relate to in somebody else, even if they're wildly different from you in most obvious, like, superficial ways. I have rarely encountered either a person in real life or a story about a person in whatever form where I didn't see part of myself in that person, regardless of what they do or how they're perceived. And the Man, he's meant to be read as though he's walked out of a parable. So in that way, he's sort of like superhuman in a way. And he's meant to be symbolic of a whole bunch of things, but he also is a human being, and I take my responsibility to render people as people seriously as an author, right? I don't, and I also sort of don't want to let the reader off the hook. I don't want to write a character that the reader is able to dismiss as a monster, right? Um, I think it's our obligation as writers to seek the human and the relatable, particularly in people who are unlike us or who we might otherwise dislike or be disdainful of, right? So that's sort of a meandering answer, I guess. But yeah, he's a terrible person in a lot of ways, but he's also fascinating, as you mentioned, you know.
There was some humanizing that I didn't expect, and I was like, oh, like I didn't think about this character in that way, but yeah, that makes sense that could be a thing that would happen. I'm being oblique because I don't want to like give it away, but like I'm trying. But so yeah, I think it's really important always, but especially now, to connect to people who are not like us. And so, if you could connect with this terrifying creature, then you can maybe connect with people that, are not the same as you. So,
Yeah, yeah,
uh,
absolutely.
yep. My next question is for William. And then I also have another question from the audience, but I'll ask my question first because I'm the moderator. I liked how we saw the neighborhood grow and change over time. The word gentrification is used a little bit. How does the changing neighborhood reflect the characters themselves?
Yeah, so the novel set between 1986 and 2004, and this is the part of Brooklyn I grew up in, obviously, and I grew up only with my last name is Scottish, but I grew up only with the Italian side of my family. My mom's Italian, so I grew up with that part of my family, and all the characters in the book are Italian American, and this was predominantly like an Italian American neighborhood area when I was growing up, and it was kind of like a dying Italian American neighborhood by the 90s, I guess. And maybe dying's a strong word, but people were leaving. People were moving to Long Island and New Jersey and Staten Island. Um, and then it started to really change, and the kind of the whole kind of just the whole, I don't know what word I'm looking for, the whole kind of fabric of the neighborhood really shifted. It was a really transitional point at some point, probably in the late 90s, early 2000s, when it started to become a kind of Chinese American neighborhood. And so it was interesting to see, because it's not, my neighborhood is not, there are a lot of parts of Brooklyn that are gentrified, and a lot of downtown Brooklyn, a lot of other neighborhoods where that's a whole other topic of conversation. That's not the case in this part of Brooklyn. This is just like remained a kind of working class neighborhood. It's just kind of the ethnicities shifted and changed it. So it's kind of changed. So it's kind of the natural order of things, but and that's kind of, I mean, it's not a main subject in the book. It's just kind of happening in the background. And I think, for characters like this, it adds to that, probably adds to their isolation, as their worlds get smaller and kind of close in around them, and the things they've known aren't really the same anymore, and they kind of lock things up more. Um, to borrow a phrase from one of my favorite movies, Carl Franklin's One False Move. So they just, I think they're kind of trapped in a way that's a little less familiar by the end of the book or something.
It's like the world, or their world, is shifting under them, and it's like, okay, where do you go with this? And there may not be a place to go. So
Yeah, it's a really fascinating, and actually, I mean, my neighborhood is now, I'm back there all the time. I don't live there anymore. My mom still lives there, and actually,
mm,
it's a much better neighborhood now than it was when I was
interesting.
growing
Yeah.
up. It's thriving and bustling and full of children. And when I was growing up, it was like there were no kids around. People were leaving. It was kind of, that wave, that generation was kind of passing
Mm.
away. So it was a much sadder place in a lot of ways.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Like, I think that my husband is really into like city development, and so that's not his job, but that's just what he's interested in. And so, you don't want the city to completely always remain stagnant, because then nothing changes. But then it's like, okay, where do people go when this changes? Are they going along? Is there a place for them to go? Do they have a Long Island to go to? Or are they just kind of like, okay, well, we have to leave and go somewhere completely different? And so, I mean, it's fascinating, for better or worse, right? It's so
Yeah.
interesting. What some of the audience was like, they said they recommend your books all the time. I'm trying to see where it was. I loved all your, she loved all your book. Beth said she loved all your books and recommends them all the time. What would he have a suggestion for which of his books he would recommend to someone who had never read him before?
Thanks, Beth. I appreciate it. I don't mean this to sound like cheesy or like I'm just kind of trying to promote this new book, but I really do feel like it's the new one. Like, I mean, I guess writers always feel like proudest of the thing
Hmm.
they just finished, but I do feel like this kind of just it's kind of, I've been building towards it in some ways, but it also feels like a summary and a revisitation of a lot
Hmm.
of the main things I've been concerned with throughout my life and as a writer. So it's Saint of the Narrow Street. That's the new one.
I love that. I was like, I hope he just says that one. That one made me, I get it. Like, this is what we're promoting. This is why we're here. Similarly, someone asked about Brendan's first two books. She said, Erica Reynolds said she loved Brendan's first two books, and she's given them to her as presents to my daughter's strings teachers. Do any of the characters from his earlier book make an appearance in this new novel? I can answer that question, but this is your panel, so I'm gonna let you answer it.
Yes, there are definitely references. Everything, my three books are all in the same universe. So they all all the characters exist at some point or another. And there's one character who was one of my personal favorites to write in the Violent Conspiracy, who makes an appearance. And it has, how do I say this without giving anything? It has ramifications that resonate throughout the rest of the story. I will say what takes place with this particular character. But yes, it's in the same universe. You'll see some references to Josephine Reed's music from Symphony of Secrets, and maybe even Ray makes an appearance from Violent Conspiracy here or there.
Okay, I'm glad I didn't answer. I almost played myself because I was gonna say no. But my excuse is that I read a lot of books. So that's on me. I'm sorry. Are there audience? There's one question that I have left, everyone, but I'm trying to leave it to the end because it's really important and I want to focus on it. So if there's any more questions anybody has, speak now or forever hold your peace. And I guess I will go ahead. This last question is for Laurie Dove. And the plot of Mask of the Dear Woman is based on the true crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women. What do you want readers to take away from your novel about this crisis? And what can readers do to help, if anything?
Thank you for asking that question. It's so important. I was elected as the mayor of my town and served there for 4 years. And one of the things that I learned when I looked systemically at how do we improve our community, it was to uncover these underlying issues that aren't necessarily policy, but are these parking lot discussions. And maybe they need to be elevated to another level. And so when I was writing this book, I began to learn about the epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous women. And even the way those numbers are tracked is problematic. So here we have a crisis that is really the undercurrent of these places where people live in this book. And the numbers officially in real life aren't even matching up. So the FBI's criminal information center, they're estimating there's approximately 5,500 missing Indigenous women currently. But then NamUs, which is the National Missing Person Database, has a number of 266. So you can see these huge gaps. We have jurisdictional issues about where someone might have gone missing from. And then we have gaps in reporting between federal, state, local, and tribal law enforcement agencies. And so in addition to these gaps that we have in reporting, to even be able to grapple with what's happening with real actionable data, we also have the very real notion that these numbers are really underreported. So even if we're taking that highest number of 5,500 missing Indigenous women right now in the United States, it's actually probably much higher than that because it is such an underreported problem.
Oh, go ahead.
Well, and I was going to say, so I have been on this journey along with maybe my readers who won't be as familiar with it until they read some of the information in the book. And the information is frankly shocking, and it's also shocking that we're not talking about it more on every kind of level in our society. And it's truly something that needs to be addressed. And it also follows that we're training people how to respond to a crisis like this. And the response is often inaction. It's not that these cases are necessarily unsolved, it's that they're uninvestigated. And the saying in my book and probably in other parts of the country is that Indigenous women disappear twice, once in life and once in the news. And I find that in the research I've done to be unfortunately very accurate.
Thank you so much for sharing this information. Myself, there's supposed to say that we have to stop talking, but please, everyone, research this. It's important. It's still something going on, and it's still something that we still look at.
Ashley, I'm sorry, I'm having trouble hearing you.
Oh, sorry.
Here,
Can you
I
hear me
can hear you now.
I don't know. Sorry about that. I got to say thanks to everybody. It was a great discussion. I had so much fun learning about your books, learning about yourselves. Thanks to all the librarians who joined us today. Next, we have two concurrent sessions. Two concurrent sessions. Be Well and Love Stories. Thank you all so much for being here. Thank you all so much for talking about these books. There are links in the chat to get them if you want to read them before they come out. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ash.
Thank you.
Thank
You
you.
guys have a good one. Bye now.